Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Kevin Carey.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for taking a few minutes to talk this afternoon. My name is Kevin Carey. I'm the director of the Education Policy Program at New America, which is a think tank, a nonpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C. I'm going to tell you the story of two people this afternoon, one of whom I've met, one of whom I haven't met, but who I hope to meet in the future. The one who I met is a woman, not a young woman, in her late 20s. She went to college. She grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. She went to college in Atlanta, to a pretty selective college that a lot of us have heard of. But she didn't graduate. And as I think we've heard throughout these conversations, that can be a pretty typical outcome for a lot of college students. It was a variety of reasons: family reasons, personal reasons, financial reasons, this kind of mix of stresses that often pushes students out of school before they finish. But she didn't graduate, so she moved back home to Washington. But she was very bright, still very motivated, got a job, worked for a small to medium-sized business, which is where many of the jobs are in our economy today, got involved in technology, started off as an office manager, worked her way up, was doing pretty well, and then when she was about 27, 28 years old, she hit a ceiling. And the ceiling was credentials. She didn't have a bachelor's degree. She didn't have a master's degree. There were certain kinds of jobs that were just no longer available to her. And when she started to talk to people about, the kinds of skills that she might need to get, but really the credential that would even get her in the door for an interview, people said, well, you should go back and get your MBA. Well, the problem is that we have this really, I would argue, kind of strange hierarchy of academic credentials here in the United States, where if she had had a bachelor's degree from pretty much any university in America that was accredited, in pretty much any subject at all, with pretty much any grades, I don't think people pay that much attention to them, and she had decent test scores, she could have gotten into an MBA program somewhere, as long as she could pay for it. But because she didn't have any of those things, she couldn't. And even though she had actually accumulated quite a bit of experience and skill working on the job, none of those things mattered at all in terms of her ability to move on towards that credential she needed. She could have moved back to Atlanta, I suppose, and tried to re-enroll in her other college, but her life was in Washington. And if she had wanted to enroll in a college in Washington to finish her bachelor's degree, she would have had to transfer all those credits over from the first place to the second place, and probably would have lost a lot of them along the way. And that was just to get to the point where she could even start the program she wanted, and even those programs took a couple of years and seemed very expensive. And if she had been in this situation even 5 years before she was in that situation, I think she would have been stuck with some difficult choices to make. But she wasn't. This was last year. And so she didn't do any of those things. She didn't re-enroll in college. She didn't get a bachelor's degree. She didn't then go on and get a master's degree. What she did was enroll in a non-accredited educational institution called General Assembly. And some of you may have heard of it, some of you may not have. What she enrolled in was a 12-week program that was designed to teach her basically everything she needed to know to get her first good job on her path forward into the career she wanted. General Assembly is an education company. It is not a college, in the sense it's not accredited by anybody. It doesn't offer degrees that have the kinds of names that have become very embedded in our society and in our human resource processes. And it doesn't have anything to do with the federal financial aid system. You can't come to them with your student loans and pay their tuition. It costs $8,000 to $10,000 for these courses, and people tend to pay with their credit cards. Why do I think this is interesting? Because I think that, and General Assembly is a growing company. It's actually doing very well. It's opening up. It's here in New York. It's in Washington. It's in San Francisco. It's in Europe. It's in Asia. There is a high demand for the programs that they're providing, because these are programs that are provided to help people get jobs in the economy that exist in the places where people want to live and work today. And I think this is important in a larger sense because there's a question that I think is hovering around this conversation, partly the conversation we're having here, the conversations that we have when we go back to our institutions, about change, about the future, about innovation, about, to use a, I think now kind of discredited word, disruption. And the big question is, what, if anything, is really going to change higher education as we know it? Because in a lot of ways, in thinking about the conversation we had last night, it really hasn't changed all that much in quite some time. And a few years ago, the answer to that question, the popular answer to that question was free online courses. We all remember this conversation. You could, if you read the New York Times, you certainly read quite a lot about it. Massive open online classes, free education to anyone who wanted it was going to be the thing that changed everything. And then about a year went by and some of the numbers started to come in, and it turned out that very few people starting these classes were finishing them, and I think that gave everyone permission to sort of sigh in relief and stop paying attention and go back to their business. I would argue that that is a mistake for a couple of reasons. First of all, just in general, when you sigh in relief and go back to your business, you stopped learning. And the person you're not paying attention to is just starting to learn because you've basically stopped paying attention to them when they made their first mistake. But they're still around. In fact, when I'm done, you're going to hear from Anat Agarwal and Daphne Kohler, who the founders, respectively, of edX and Coursera, two of the providers of the massive open online courses. They're still very much in business. There was a great article actually this morning in the New York Times on the front page of the business section. Some of you might have read it while you were having your breakfast this morning. It was by Farhad Manjoo. And it was about Udacity, another one of these original MOOC companies that were making all of these grand proclamations about how they were going to change the world as they know it. And the one thing that ties them all together, and the one thing that characterizes the way they understand their business now, is that they don't think the way they're going to change education is through education. It's through credentials. Credentials. This is the mistake I think we've been making in terms of what disruption might mean, what innovation might mean. You don't really change anything in a, if we can use the word industry or sector or space, you don't really change anything until you change the business. And the business of higher education fundamentally is the business of credentials, not education. Now, let me tell you what I mean by that. Of course, education is what we do. Education is why people come to higher education. That's the activity we're conveying to our students. But lots and lots of different kinds of organizations can be in the education business. Arguably, the New York Times is fundamentally in the business about making people smarter, enlightening them, and they're in the private sector and they charge money. It's credentials that distinguishes colleges as businesses that help people learn from everyone else. It's the credentials that drive people into higher education as a sector. Now, I can think of some of the responses that you might get, and some of the responses I have gotten over the years as I've talked to people about this. And one of them is, well, that's all well and good, these new companies, but that's not what we do. And I would remind you that that probably isn't true. That probably is what you're doing. If you're running a university of any size, you probably have a very robust professional master's degree program. In fact, when universities sat down to think about how to balance their budgets and grow revenue over the last 5 or 10 years, I think right up there with the full-paid Chinese student, the person who comes over and pays full tuition and subsidizes everyone else, professional master's degrees programs. And the great thing about a master's degree program is that you can say it's a 1-year program instead of a 2-year program. You can say it's a 9-month program instead of a 1-year program. And you can make a master's degree program in just about anything. I mean, there's just looking a few minutes ago at the roster of master's degrees at a very well-known university right here in New York City, an AAU institution, master's degree in real estate, master's degree in sports management, master's degree in construction management, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are all the jobs that people are going into. Now, the other response is, well, that's fine, that's professional education, that's skills, but we do so much more than that for our students in our undergraduate programs. And there's truth in that. But we have to ask ourselves and be honest about how much truth there is in that. I think we've become very good in higher education at talking about the larger virtues that we bring to our students beyond skills, the things that we teach them, the people we help them become beyond just being workers. We're very good at talking about those things. I would argue we're not as good at actually doing them. And I think that the real authentic commitment in a lot of institutions to really helping their students gain those skills is lacking. We certainly don't have all that much evidence that students really are gaining all the things that we say we're trying to teach them. There's really not that much way in terms of curricular rigor at a lot of institutions. And if we think about the difference between higher education 40 years ago and now, all the students who weren't in college then, who have come since then, almost to a person, those students have come for economic reasons. We're enrolling about the same number of English lit majors that we did in the 1970s relative to the population. The explosion has been in people majoring in business and business-like programs. Those people are going through 4 years of college, not necessarily because they're sure they need 4 years of college in order to get a good job in a business. That's just the only option that's ever been available to them before. You couldn't do anything else because it was that credential that you had to have. So I think that we are headed into an era, an explosion of new kinds of credentials, and that's going to be the thing that really shakes up the market for higher education. I said 2 people, and I'll just talk briefly about the second one. I haven't met this second person. She's a woman. She lives not in the United States. She lives in some place like Vietnam. She lives in Nigeria. She lives in one of the countries that has been the beneficiary of the great moral triumph of our age, which is the huge reduction in the number of people worldwide who are living in abject poverty. Billions of people over the last 30 years have made that transition from pure poverty to the next step. And the next step is, broadly defined, the global middle class. And if you look at even just the medium level projections from the OECD about the number of people who are going to join the global middle class between today and 2030, it is more people than have ever gone to college in the history of humankind. And once you're in that position where you're not living a life of existential crisis, where every day is not a struggle for survival, certainly nothing like the living standards that we enjoy here, but not the same as starving, not the same as being in fear for your life. The next thing you want is education. And we are not going to build at scale anything resembling American or Western-style universities for all of those people. We are going to build new institutions with new kinds of credentials, and we are going to begin with the premise of information technology, not added on to what we had before. So you put those 2 things together, the explosion of new kinds of credentials and the explosion in demand for new kinds of education around the world. And I would say that the future for all of you is going to be an intensity and kind of competition that really American colleges and universities have never experienced before. It may seem intense now. It is going to be multivariate and intense in all kinds of new ways. It's going to be a great opportunity for your institutions that are revered really throughout the world as implicitly being the best educational institutions on earth. But you have to start thinking now about how you're going to live in this world of new kinds of credentials. You have to start thinking now about how you're going to compete with the institutions that will inevitably rise up to serve those billions of students around the world. Thank you very much for listening this afternoon.